It was the summer of 1867 when the first sighting of Timothy Caldwell was recorded in the mining town of Dovetail Creek, nestled deep within the Colorado Territory. The town, known mostly for its rich veins of silver and the constant sound of pickaxes clinking against stone, was no stranger to transients, miners, and the occasional drifter. But Timothy was different. He was first seen at dusk, standing alone near the edge of the old trestle bridge, barefoot, dirt-smudged, and clothed in a linen shirt far too clean for someone who claimed to have wandered in from the wilds. No one could say exactly where he'd come from. There were no witnesses to his arrival, no tracks along the trail, and no wagons missing a passenger. He had simply appeared, as if placed there by unseen hands. He looked to be about 10 years old, but there was something strange in his posture, too still, too deliberate, like he was aware of being watched and was performing silence. When approached by Sheriff Walter Greaves, Timothy offered no name, no words at all. It wasn't until the schoolteacher, Miss Clara Hensley, took his hand and whispered gently to him that he finally spoke. "Timothy," he said. Just the name. No last name, no place of origin. And yet he said it as if he was remembering, not introducing himself. Word spread quickly. In a town where nothing remained secret for long, Timothy became a mystery the entire community adopted. The local doctor, Elias Brandt, was the first to raise concerns. He examined the boy thoroughly and found no injuries, no signs of malnutrition, and, most puzzling of all, no heartbeat. Brandt initially dismissed this as a faulty stethoscope, but 3 more instruments confirmed the same result. He wrote in his journal that, "The child's chest rises and falls like clockwork, but there is no pulse to be found, nor warmth to the skin." Timothy's body remained a cool, consistent temperature, no matter the heat of the summer sun or the warmth of the hearth. Yet despite all of this, Timothy functioned as any boy might. He played, walked, listened, and even learned. He never ate. Never drank. He was brought food daily by concerned townsfolk, who noted with growing unease that it remained untouched, yet no signs of weakness or illness ever emerged. The schoolchildren at first avoided him, but slowly, a few grew curious. Lila Morse, aged 9, later recounted that Timothy never blinked. Not once. She said he would sit in class with his eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly ahead for hours, even when the oil lamps dimmed and others struggled to keep their eyes open. Strangest of all were the conflicting memories of his arrival. Several people swore they had seen Timothy before he appeared. Hiram Bell, the barkeep at the Red Lantern Saloon, claimed that Timothy had passed through town 3 years prior with a group of traveling performers, a claim quickly contradicted by others who insisted he had never been there at all. Mrs. Dunleavy, an elderly widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town, stated in a sworn statement that she remembered raising him from birth, though when questioned further, she could not recall what year he was born or who the father might have been. Her recollections were filled with contradictions. Some days she said he liked to read scripture, other days she swore he was mute and feared books. The timeline grew murkier the longer Timothy stayed. Dates began to blur. One of the miners, Joseph Creedy, mentioned in his diary that the sun had set an hour too early one night. "Either I'm going mad," he wrote, "or that boy is taking pieces of the day with him." Pastor Enoch Bellwether became increasingly distressed during sermons, often stopping mid-sentence when Timothy entered the church. He once claimed the boy's presence made the candles flicker backwards, as if light was being drawn in instead of pushed out. Despite all these anomalies, no one could pinpoint a single moment when Timothy became real. He simply began to exist in the memory of the town. People spoke of him as if he had always been there. School ledgers were found with his name dated months prior to his arrival. The town census, handwritten and kept under lock by Mayor Lindell, suddenly included a neat, inked entry: Timothy Caldwell, age 10, place of birth, unknown. No one admitted to writing it, yet the ink was dry, the handwriting matched, and the page had not been tampered with. There was something about Timothy's presence that reshaped memory itself. Conversations around him became hard to recall. People would enter a room with him and emerge moments later, unsure of what had been said or done. The only consistent details across all recollections were his calm demeanor, the silence that clung to him, and his eyes, an odd, deep gray that reflected light like polished stone. Dr. Elias Brandt was the first to officially document Timothy Caldwell's abnormalities in a medical journal he kept hidden beneath loose floorboards in his study. His notes, dated June 14, 1867, began with an observation that should have led to a swift referral to any known medical authority, if such authorities had answers for what he was witnessing. "The boy does not exhibit typical human anatomy as we understand it," he wrote. "Though he breathes, his chest movements are shallow, rhythmic, and mechanical. Palpation of the wrist yields no pulse, and his skin retains no warmth, always cold, yet never clammy." The doctor's entries would grow increasingly frantic as the months passed, but his initial examinations already hinted at the biological enigma Timothy posed. Timothy's skin was smooth and seemingly impervious to injury. During one examination, Brandt attempted a standard blood test by pricking the boy's finger with a sterilized lancet. No blood emerged. The skin did not break. Puzzled, the doctor pressed harder, this time using a surgical blade, and still, nothing. No mark was left, not even the faint redness one might expect from pressure. The doctor, both fascinated and unnerved, wrote, "It is as if the boy is carved from soft stone, not flesh. Yet he moves, speaks, and breathes like any living being." The strangeness extended far beyond his skin. Timothy's eyes, when examined under lamplight, reflected like those of an animal. Not just a simple red glare from the retina, but a multi-hued, metallic shimmer, golds, silvers, and faint greens swirled like oil on water. He could stare directly into flame or the midday sun without flinching, and even in absolute darkness, he moved with an uncanny certainty, as if the world around him glowed for his vision alone. When asked about this, Timothy never gave a clear answer. "I don't see things the way you do," was his only explanation, and he offered it without emotion. His skeletal structure also seemed atypical. During a particularly desperate attempt to understand Timothy's physiology, Dr. Brandt convinced the boy to allow himself to be X-rayed, or rather, subjected to a crude radiographic test available at the time through borrowed military equipment. The resulting image terrified the physician. Timothy's bones were faint, irregularly spaced, and in several places, entirely missing or distorted. His ribcage appeared asymmetrical, almost floral in shape, with odd curling extensions toward his spine. There was no clear sign of a heart or stomach. One dark mass hovered where a heart should have been, but it seemed too large, too dense, and its outline shifted slightly in every exposure taken. His hair and nails never grew. Over months, Clara Hensley, who had taken it upon herself to maintain Timothy's grooming, noted that his hair remained precisely the same length and texture, soft, white blonde, and unnaturally fine. She once attempted to trim a lock for safekeeping, only to find the scissors slide uselessly across the strands as if repelled by them. The nails on his fingers and toes were equally inert, never chipping, cracking, or lengthening. One evening, she watched as a splinter of wood from her classroom desk slid under his fingernail, and instead of bleeding or reacting in pain, Timothy merely observed it. The next day, the splinter was gone, as though his body had simply absorbed it. Beyond the physical impossibilities, there were subtle, more disturbing signs. Animals refused to go near him. Horses, dogs, even cats would shy away, growling low or bolting the moment Timothy approached. A local hunter, Silas Granger, recalled the time Timothy wandered near his hound's pen. "They wailed like they were lookin' straight through hell," he told townsfolk, shaking his head. "Never heard dogs make that sound before. They was mournin', I swear it." And yet, Timothy never displayed aggression or cruelty. He remained calm, soft-spoken, and eerily observant. Temperature had no effect on him. During the harsh winter of 1868, when frostbite took the toes of several townsfolk and even caused a death, Timothy continued walking barefoot through snowdrifts. Miss Hensley and the mayor tried to gift him shoes, but he politely declined, saying, "I don't feel cold like you do." And indeed, snow would melt around him, not from heat, but as if it was being rejected by his presence. He never shivered, never perspired, never sneezed or coughed. One final observation unnerved Dr. Brandt to the point of near breakdown. During a thunderstorm, lightning struck the weather vane atop the schoolhouse. Several townspeople were knocked off their feet by the shockwave. Timothy, who had been standing beneath it, took the full brunt of the strike. Witnesses screamed, expecting his body to be reduced to ash. Instead, he remained upright, eyes wide, arms slightly raised, his skin glowing faintly blue for a full minute after. He looked at Clara Hensley and said calmly, that one spoke louder than the others. It was Lila Morse who first suggested that Timothy Caldwell could see thoughts. At the time, her claim was dismissed as childish imagination, the sort of thing one might expect from a girl raised on ghost stories and frontier myths. But as more accounts emerged, all quietly and reluctantly shared in hushed voices behind church pews or over backroom poker games, her strange idea gained weight. Those who spent time near Timothy began to notice that he often responded before they spoke, sometimes turning to them with a question already answered or an emotion already soothed. He didn't interrupt, and he didn't guess, he simply seemed to know, as if the act of speaking out loud was merely a formality he no longer needed. Mayor Lindell was among the first adults to admit the feeling openly, though never in public. In his private letters, later discovered among his estate papers, he wrote, "The boy unnerves me. When I approach him with an intention in my mind, he meets my eyes and it is as if the intention dies there, snuffed out. He nods before I speak, shakes his head when I lie, and once, when I tried to test him by holding an absurd thought, about painting my house upside down, he laughed. Not politely. Not vaguely. He laughed hard, as if I'd said it aloud." Timothy never claimed to be reading minds. He never offered an explanation, nor did he confirm anyone's suspicions. But more than a dozen townsfolk recorded moments in which they believed he'd accessed their inner thoughts. Miss Hensley once asked him what his favorite book was, and Timothy replied with the title she had been silently considering gifting him. When Reverend Bellwether tried to offer him a sermon on purity and innocence, Timothy looked at him with an expression that made the pastor go silent for over a minute before sitting down without another word. He later told his wife, "He knew what I had done in Baton Rouge. I saw it in his eyes, like a reflection." Children seemed the most susceptible to whatever force Timothy was using. During recess, groups of them would gather around him and fall into long stretches of quiet play, as if communicating without speaking. When questioned afterward, they often gave vague answers. "We just knew what to do," said one boy. "He showed us in our heads," said another. The school bell would ring, and they would rise in unison and walk back inside, leaving teachers wondering why the usual shouting and disobedience had ceased entirely when Timothy was among them. It wasn't just thoughts. Several incidents pointed toward Timothy influencing emotions as well. During an outbreak of violence between miners and railroad workers over pay disputes, Timothy stood between the two crowds at the edge of Main Street. Witnesses reported a sudden stillness, a collective sense of embarrassment, even shame. Men who had been shouting insults moments before lowered their weapons and walked away, some muttering apologies, others shaking their heads in confusion. Sheriff Greaves, who had been ready to draw his revolver, dropped it to his side and whispered, "It felt like my anger evaporated." Dreams were another matter entirely. Dozens of Dovetail Creek residents began reporting vivid, lucid dreams in which Timothy appeared. In these dreams, he was never a child. Sometimes he was old, ancient even, with white hair and eyes that changed color with every blink. Other times he appeared as a glowing figure, featureless but unmistakably him, communicating in thought, not speech. People woke with images of unfamiliar symbols burned into their minds, spirals within spirals, shifting geometries, stars bending in impossible directions. A few residents began sketching these symbols, often identical to each other despite no collaboration or conversation. These sketches were collected by the mayor's office, but eventually hidden away after a council vote deemed them too disturbing for the general public. Reverend Bellwether, increasingly agitated by the influence Timothy seemed to have, accused him during Sunday service of being an agent of deception. But mid-sermon, as he began to declare Timothy's presence unnatural, he froze mid-sentence. Witnesses said his eyes darted around the congregation, locking briefly with Timothy's. He then stepped down from the pulpit, walked straight out of the church, and was not seen in town again. His belongings were found undisturbed, his coat still hanging on its hook. A few townsfolk claimed Timothy could show people things. Not just thoughts or feelings, but entire memories, sometimes not even their own. Mrs. Clara Hensley once described an afternoon when Timothy, unprompted, placed his hand on hers. She was instantly flooded with images, a desert landscape she had never visited, a child crying in a language she didn't understand, the sensation of floating above a lake made of glass. She wept, not from sadness but from what she described as, remembering something I never lived through. Others reported similar encounters, each time experiencing brief flashes of visions that didn't belong to them, followed by an aching sense of something just out of reach. In the months following Timothy Caldwell's arrival, the town's curiosity gradually turned into obsession. What began as cautious hospitality soon became a coordinated effort by Dovetail Creek's most educated and ambitious minds to solve the mystery of the boy who defied explanation. At the center of this effort was Dr. Elias Brandt, who, after failing to draw blood, record a heartbeat, or produce a coherent anatomical chart, reached out to contacts in Denver and St. Louis. Within weeks, 2 traveling scholars, a naturalist named Walter Delcom and an anatomist named Professor Ezra Kleint, arrived to examine Timothy for themselves. They were introduced to the boy at Miss Hensley's schoolhouse, where he sat quietly at a desk, sketching unfamiliar symbols in charcoal. Delcom, initially skeptical, approached Timothy with the casual confidence of a man who had debunked dozens of local legends. But within minutes, his tone shifted. He asked Timothy to open his mouth, shine a lantern into his throat, and check for the uvula. It was missing. Not damaged, absent, as though it had never existed. When he tapped Timothy's knee with a reflex hammer, there was no twitch, but Timothy raised his leg and held it in place, as if performing the response manually. Kleint's investigation was more invasive. He attempted to record brain activity using primitive galvanometers and probes. Nothing registered. The equipment responded to the researchers themselves, but remained inert near Timothy. As though, Kleint later noted in his journal, his body absorbs electricity, rather than conducting it. Encouraged by these anomalies, a group of townsfolk began to participate in a series of experiments conducted in the old mill house. They kept Timothy under close observation for several days and nights, hoping to track even the smallest biological fluctuation. They measured his breathing, his posture, his reaction to light and temperature. He complied without resistance, never expressing discomfort or confusion, but he spoke less and less as time wore on. His gaze grew distant. Miss Hensley, allowed to visit him during the experiment, noted that Timothy appeared to become dull, like a candle under a glass dome. The 4th night of testing became a turning point. Professor Kleint attempted what he described as a controlled pain stimulus, pressing a heated needle against the soft skin of Timothy's inner arm. The needle hissed, but Timothy showed no reaction. Instead, the flame on the nearby oil lamp flickered violently, even though the room was sealed tight. One of the townsmen, Eli Marnes, fell backward from his chair and convulsed briefly, clutching his chest. He claimed to see a face in the flames, not Timothy's, but something older, watching from behind the boy's eyes. Following this incident, half the volunteers refused to return. The remaining few, now gripped by a feverish determination, escalated the experiments. They drew salt circles on the floor, tried to measure shadow lengths during the night, and even placed Timothy in total sensory deprivation, submerging him in a darkened cellar with cotton in his ears and cloth over his eyes. After 4 hours, they returned to find him exactly as they'd left him, except the lanterns above had all gone out. Miss Hensley, furious upon learning what had been done, pulled him from the cellar and brought him back to the schoolhouse, where he slept for nearly 36 hours without moving. The obsession had consequences. Dr. Brandt began experiencing sleepwalking episodes, often waking with fresh pages of scribbled notes he didn't remember writing. The mayor's assistant, Gerald Stowe, was found muttering numbers under his breath and had to be confined to his home after attempting to dig a hole beneath the church altar. Professor Kleint suffered a complete breakdown. He claimed Timothy's presence had torn a hole in the known order of things, and in a final letter, he warned that continuing to study the boy would risk drawing attention from whatever he belongs to. Kleint vanished soon after, leaving behind a satchel of burnt journals and a single preserved tooth wrapped in muslin cloth. No one could identify what species it belonged to. Despite the setbacks, the townspeople's fascination with Timothy deepened. They began holding secret meetings, exchanging theories that ranged from the biblical to the extraterrestrial. Some believed Timothy was an angel sent to test them, others that he was a weapon, a fragment of something older and larger, smuggled into their world through a crack they had failed to notice. The experiments, though less organized, continued in private. One farmer tried to test Timothy's limits by walking him into the mines at night. When they emerged hours later, the farmer was covered in black soot and refused to speak for 3 days. He later claimed he had seen light coming from inside the rocks and heard the mountain whispering Timothy's name. As time passed, the town began to fracture. Arguments erupted over whether the boy should be sent away, worshipped, or buried alive beneath consecrated ground. The school closed. The church emptied. People locked their doors and covered their mirrors. Yet Timothy remained, wandering the town like a shadow wearing skin, unchanged by the tests, unbothered by the scrutiny. He watched as the town began to turn against itself, his expression unreadable, his eyes as gray and unreadable as the sky before a storm. It was on the cold morning of October 3, 1874, that Dovetail Creek awoke to the smell of smoke and the distant sound of bells clanging wildly. The old church, a stone and timber structure built by the town's founding families, was ablaze. Flames twisted up into the gray sky, pulling screams from the throats of those who had once sat quietly in its pews. The fire had started in the early hours, before sunrise, and spread with unnatural speed. Some claimed the flame had jumped from wall to wall without ever touching the floor. Others said the glass windows melted without cracking, and that the great iron bell, which had not rung in over a year, let out one final groan just before the steeple collapsed inward like a folding hand. Timothy Caldwell had last been seen walking toward the church just hours before the fire. Miss Clara Hensley, who had grown more protective of the boy in recent months, stated that he left her home without a word. He'd stared out the window all evening, silent and unmoving, until suddenly rising and heading into the fog, barefoot as always. She followed briefly but lost him near the edge of the town square. No one else claimed to see him after that, until the flames brought the entire community to their doors. Despite the intensity of the fire, there were no casualties. The church had been empty, at least it should have been. When the flames died down and the ashes cooled, the townsfolk gathered around the ruin to search for answers. Among the blackened beams and scorched altar, they found something unexpected, a perfect circle, burned clean through the stone floor. It was 10 feet in diameter, untouched by soot or ember. Its edges were sharp, smooth, and emitted a faint warmth, as if it had just been carved by something not of this world. In its center lay a single object, Timothy's schoolbook, open to a blank page that shimmered slightly under the light, even though no ink had ever touched it. There were no remains. No bones, no scraps of clothing, nothing to suggest Timothy had perished in the fire. Sheriff Greaves organized a full excavation of the site, digging beneath the floor in search of hidden chambers, tunnels, or any sign of escape. Nothing was found. The stone beneath the church gave way to bedrock, and beyond that, silence. The sheriff, in his report, wrote, "If he burned, he left nothing behind. If he escaped, he passed through stone. The mystery only deepened when a traveling priest, Father Domingo Cortázar, arrived 3 days later. Having heard of the incident from another township, he demanded access to the ruins. After a short visit, he left abruptly, refusing food, and muttered prayers in Latin the entire journey out of town. He left behind a letter that warned, that was not a church fire. That was a closing. What remained of the church was quickly cordoned off, but rumors spread faster than any official statement could contain. Some whispered that they had seen Timothy standing in the flames, untouched, looking not frightened but serene. One woman swore she saw 3 identical figures beside him, shadow forms that shimmered like heat rising off iron. Others claimed the smoke had carried voices, not screams, but chants, repeating a name no one could later recall. Mayor Lindell fell into a state of paranoia after visiting the site. He resigned days later and was found weeks afterward wandering the hills, covered in dirt, clutching a small stone carved with a spiral that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The town's historian, Jonathan Reed, later admitted to discovering something beneath the altar before the fire, a set of markings etched into the stone that matched symbols found in several of the dreams townspeople had reported months earlier. He had planned to document them and send them to a university but never got the chance. The only surviving sketch was found torn and buried among the church rubble. It showed a diagram of interlocking circles, with a human figure in the center, surrounded by notations in a language no one recognized. Timothy's disappearance was never officially declared a death. No funeral was held. No eulogy spoken. Some said it was because no one knew what to say. Others believed that to speak his name aloud would invite something back. Yet over the weeks that followed, townspeople reported odd occurrences. Doors opening without sound. Clocks stopping at 3:17 a.m. Children waking from sleep with ash on their fingertips. One child, just 5 years old, whispered to his mother, "Timothy says it's quieter now. He made it stop spinning." Dr. Brandt, once the town's most respected figure, locked himself in his office following the fire and refused to see patients. He was last seen dragging a heavy trunk toward the base of the cliffs, mumbling about starting over. When Miss Hensley returned to the schoolhouse to resume lessons, she found Timothy's desk empty but unaged, untouched by time. Its surface, unlike the others, bore no dust. Underneath it, she discovered a small stone fragment that pulsed faintly when held against her palm. Nearly a year after the fire consumed the old church and Timothy Caldwell vanished without a trace, the town of Dovetail Creek received an unexpected delivery. It came in the form of a locked, weather-worn chest, delivered by 2 men who claimed no knowledge of its origin beyond the shipping order attached to its lid. The name listed was simply, "for the town historian," and no sender was recorded. The chest, covered in burn marks and sealed with 3 rusted clasps, gave off a faint metallic scent, one that several townspeople would later describe as ozone and rain. It was Jonathan Reed, the town's increasingly reclusive historian, who reluctantly agreed to open it under witness. Inside were a series of notebooks, each bound in cracked leather and filled with impossibly neat handwriting, all dated between 1867 and 1874. The pages were organized like a journal, but the entries didn't follow a clear timeline. Some were titled with future dates, others with phrases like, "the Fifth Gate" or "Memory 12B." Most unsettling, every journal bore the name, Timothy Caldwell, written on its spine. Some entries were written in English, others in a spiraling, unfamiliar script that flickered faintly in lamplight, as if the ink itself was alive. The townspeople, gathered quietly around the historian's study, read in silence as Jonathan began to translate. The journals contained accounts of events no one remembered, days that never occurred, people who were never born, and places that did not exist on any known map. One entry described a festival held in Dovetail Creek where everyone wore white masks and danced until dawn, though no such event had ever happened. Another spoke of a sudden snowfall in mid-July, accompanied by laughter from the sky and birds flying backward. There were maps drawn in red ink showing the town from impossible angles, as if viewed from above and within at the same time. On one map, the schoolhouse was marked with the word origin. On another, the church was labeled the mouth. More disturbingly, the journals began to reference the townspeople by name, not just in passing, but in eerily precise detail. One page described Miss Clara Hensley reading by candlelight, and quoted her exact internal thoughts as she turned a page. Another recorded the final dream of Sheriff Greaves, complete with images he had never spoken aloud to anyone. A third entry simply listed the names of every child born in the town that decade, followed by notes like, "Will leave, will forget," and, "For 2 names, will follow." Among the pages were symbols that matched those found on the walls of the burned church, as well as sketches of machines and geometric shapes that defied physical laws. One image appeared to be a spiral made of doors, each slightly ajar, leading into other spirals. Another drawing showed a human figure surrounded by orbs labeled frequency, witness, and echo. Several pages were blackened at the edges, with notes scribbled in frantic handwriting: "He is not a boy," and "The skin is only a placeholder," and "They made him remember forward." The final journal in the chest was different. Its cover was smooth, unmarked, and cold to the touch. When opened, it revealed just one page, a charcoal drawing of the Dovetail Creek town square, rendered with impossible precision, showing every crack in the stonework and every shadow cast by the sun. At the center of the square stood Timothy Caldwell, facing away, his head tilted slightly upward, as though listening. Beneath the image was a single phrase written in a looping script that matched no known language. Yet all who looked at it claimed they understood its meaning. Each person gave a slightly different translation, but all circled the same idea: it has begun again. Following the discovery of the journals, a quiet paranoia took root in town. Clocks stopped synchronizing. Dreams became shared experiences. Children began using words they had never been taught. A 6-year-old recited one of the unknown journal languages in her sleep. The town's blacksmith, Abel Gorin, built a large mirror with no reflection and refused to explain why. A light tremor shook the hills every week at exactly the same hour, 3:17 a.m., the time noted in multiple journal entries as the recall point. Jonathan Reed, though initially fascinated, began to deteriorate. He wrote obsessively, filling notebook after notebook with symbols, equations, and mirrored sentences. One night he wandered into the ruins of the church and carved a message into the stone with his fingernail. It read, "Memory is a closed room." He left the window open. The next morning, he was gone. His study, once filled with historical records and maps, now contained only a single object on the desk, a smooth white stone, shaped like an eye, that pulsed softly in the dark. In the weeks that followed, more pages appeared, tucked into books, hidden beneath floorboards, even folded inside the bark of trees. All were written in the same hand, all bearing the name Timothy Caldwell. B5.